So I always find it interesting, like in the last, so this is the last little section of the class. It's getting into some really complex, difficult phenomena, and I'm not sure how well I'm going to be able to communicate some of this, but it's really important, and it's important not just because you need to know some of this for the test, but it's important in the sense that, well, I hope that you're able to take some of this material in a way that can help you in your life and maybe open you up to a different way of thinking about your life and your relationship to the world and society and your future and all this sort of thing. So, but it's difficult. It's really difficult. When I see like the numbers kind of dropping significantly toward the end, I mean, one interpretation is that, oh, it's just everyone's kind of preparing, everyone's working on assignments and things like that. I wonder as well, though, if some of this material is a bit scary or anxiety provoking for some people, and there's like a subtle avoidance, or this is just too much for me to try to wrap my head around, that sort of thing. I don't know. But I would ask you to, like, more so than any of the other lectures, like, try to be present, try to be engaged. Don't allow yourself to get distracted easily or busy with your iPhones and things like that, because there's a lot, I think, that you might be able to take away from it. So this is the end of in a way, like, is there a question there? No? You sure? So this is the end of what should be a story, or should be like a narrative, an interpretation, a way of understanding the human being, the person. And if we go back to that question and we toy around with some of the answers that psychology had tried to give to that question, is the person something that we could understand in the way that a behaviorist might, from an extrospective third-person frame, imagining that the person is like some present-at-hand entity or a current object or something like that, just merely responding to stimuli in the environment, that we don't really have to give any serious attention to, whatever's happening introspectively in the experience of the individual. Well, we answered, I think, no to that question, that the behaviorist is not able to account for a great many things. We can ask, well, is the person in a more complex way, perhaps, understood in the way that, that we might try to explain the workings of a computer as an efficient cause, programming language, or, the switching on and off of transistors. And maybe this is a metaphor that can be, is instantiated within the nervous system or something like that. And again, I think, we answered no to that question. Existentialism, is an attempt to take seriously, again, the first-person subject, the agent. And in the words of Rollo May, it is an endeavor to understand the person by cutting below the cleavage between the subject and the object, which is bedeviled Western thought and science since shortly after the Renaissance. So this is, again, fitting with some of the things that we've talked about. The reason why I assigned that chapter, it's a long chapter, it's a tough chapter, but there's a lot in there. And it reminds us again of some of the pitfalls that we've run into in trying to understand the human being. So again, René Descartes, proposed that there is the res cogitan, the thinking subject, over against, the res extensa, extended matter. And the scientific endeavor had taken up this approach that would try to interpret the world as an assemblage of materiality or objects. And when we take some of those same causal assumptions and metaphysical assumptions and we apply it to ourselves, we're at great risk of misunderstanding ourselves. So the subject, the individual, the first-person experiencer, is not separate from their body in a traditional Cartesian dualistic sense, but nor are we separate from the world, right? The world is a part of us. We are a part of the world. We want to keep that in mind. So when we ask the question, okay, well, again, I'll kind of draw in some of the Heideggerian type stuff and phenomenology. How do we interpret the person? How do we understand the person? Well, the person, in a way, is, first and foremost, is Well, we go back to Dasein. Dasein is being here. There's a clearing that opens up, a receptivity. We are embodied. We are dwelling within a body. There's a sense of, intuitive sense of ownership in the body that we have and the experiences that we have. We are thrown into a world. We find ourselves, we discover ourselves in a particular mood or emotion that discloses the world in a particular light and allows meaningful phenomena to show up in the way that it does. And remember, just our way of being attuned through our moods is, greatly influenced by the ways in which others have been with us and have attuned to us and have, in a sense, held open that experiential clearing that we can, that we can tolerate our emotions, that we can be in the presence of other people in that way. That's very important. So again, keeping in mind that idea of like an authentic human being, a healthy personality is a person that is able to be relatively open in what their capacity to bear certain kinds of emotions, in how the world discloses itself, how we relate to other people, and so on. So we find ourselves in our thrownness through moods and emotions, but we are also always already instantiated within a world, within a referential totality of involvements and ready-to-hand equipment that we just take up unthinkingly. It's not mechanistic. It's operating at a tacit level. There's this implicit level in which we are, comporting ourselves in our life world. And so we are always already in a world. We are projecting ourselves from the present into future possibilities that are intelligible within that sociocultural world in which we dwell, and possible ways of relating to people, and so we go back to this question of, freedom and constraint. Are we constrained in various ways? Yes, absolutely. We are constrained in terms of our biology. We are constrained in terms of our sociocultural interpretations and this tacit familiarity within which we dwell. But between those constraints, there is a freedom or an unsettledness in a way, and it is part of just the nature of our way of being in the world, that we can transcend any given moment in a sense, that we can negate what is and bounce off of that and rise above that and kind of play in these possibilities. And there's a freedom there. It's not a superlative freedom. It's not an infinite freedom, but there's a freedom that's there, and an unsettledness in our way of being. And so Dasein is that being whose way of being is an issue for itself. And Dasein, as we'll see, it must take a stand on its being, its attitude that it takes up in the life that we live. So there's a freedom, there's an unsettledness in our way of being that is not the case for rocks and tables and plants and slugs and things of that nature, arguably. But with that freedom, with that way of kind of being in the world existentially, there are concerns or issues that we have to contend with in some way. And as we'll see, we can contend with these existential givens in an authentic way, in a way that faces it with courage and bears a certain amount of existential anxiety, or we can flee from these novel possibilities and hide from these issues. So this is basically an outline of what we're going to be talking about in the next 4 lectures here. One of the givens of existence is death. And I don't mean death in the sense that we know that people die. That's a scientific attitude or a scientific way of understanding mortality. What I mean by this is really taking on board and considering our own finitude. Not that people die, but that I will die. And confronting that in an authentic way brings about a fair bit of anxiety, because I think we like to imagine, we have this wonderful idea that, especially you being young people, that I'm going to live until I'm 70 or 80 or, and that death is going to be, a graceful decline or something of that sort. That may be the case, but it may not be, right? I think it was just this past week, you might have heard the story of this guy that just went into the hospital with the common flu and then died, right? And so, there's a good chance that just even within this room, that within the next 5 years, that maybe, 2 or 3 of us will no longer be here. And we imagine that's going to happen to other people, and we feel sad and empathic that other people will face this fate, but we often fail to really take that on in terms of a possibility for ourselves. And it disrupts, in a way, our ongoing activity. Well, we have all these plans and goals and ways of engaging with people and, Netflix shows that we need to watch and like all this other kind of superficial kind of stuff, And so to imagine that it could just all come to an end like that is really destabilizing, There's the issue as it relates to meaning and coherence that we as human beings, we have the ability to wonder, question, well, what is this for? What is this about? What am I to do? And so we want the world to be intelligible. We want it to make sense. We want it to be structured. We want it to be orderly. And we want it to offer us like an infallible guide of some sort, right? And we want to find our place in it. We want to know that we have a place in it. We don't want any of that to be in doubt. For it to be in doubt is to, threatens, this to throw us into chaos, a groundlessness. But the reality is that I think if we recognize that many of the meaning systems that we abide by, they were co-constructed by other human beings, And so there already is a kind of groundlessness to our existence. We don't recognize that the meaning systems that we use as guides to, to comport ourselves in the world, like they are, they are a relative kind of meaning system. And we can notice this at times when there are cracks or fissures that open up in our sociocultural interpretations. And it's like a glitch in the matrix kind of thing, And when these moments happen for you, they can, flood you with anxiety and terror, and you have this momentary experience of uncanniness, like feeling not at home in the world. And the world just seems to show up as just a bunch of just things that are almost unintelligible. You can't find your place in it. And Camus referred to this as the feeling of the absurd. And there's a way of dealing with that, so that you can do that, you can deal with this, you can confront this issue in a way that is relatively authentic, that you try to bear as much of that anxiety as possible and use it in a way to create authentic choices for yourself, or you can hide from it and double down in a sense and take up some cultural interpretation or dogma or whatever it is to give you that false sense of security. And the same with death, of course, too, right? And then there's the given of freedom, arguably. When we think about freedom, we typically think about freedom as a good thing, right? And we think about freedom from constraint. But we often don't think about freedom as being burdensome in a way. If there's, a freedom of sorts, a freedom even to create the meaning systems that structure our lives, to be able to determine, good from evil, right from wrong, and, take on that my choices, have a genuine impact in the world. There's a certain amount of guilt that you must kind of ready yourself for as well, because your choices, may disappoint people, may harm people, may harm yourself, may betray yourself in a way. So can we recognize our relative freedom? Can we own our possibilities? Or will we free from this self-authorship and allow ourselves to be taken over by various cultural interpretations that would seem to deny our freedom? So society and culture and again, we are a part of culture, culture is a part of us, can help us contend with these existential givens, and they can help us contend with these issues in an authentic way that allows us to carry a certain amount of existential anxiety as it relates to these issues, and keep open those possibilities to be the fullest version of ourselves as we can be. Or society can work in maybe a more nefarious way, or a way to cover over or conceal some of these issues. And the average everyday way of being in the world is that many of these issues get covered over or ignored. They're repressed, or in many cases they're just denied as an issue altogether. So that's a rough outline of what we're going to try to talk about or try to do. Any questions about any of that before we get going? So Ernest Becker, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, it reminds us again of how we are different from other non-human animals. Only humans engage in true symbolic behavior. We create labels for objects and then respond to the arbitrary designations we have just assigned. We create the relationships between stimuli and then assign our own stimulus meanings. I'm quoting Becker here. Nature provided all of life with water, but only man could create the symbol H2O, which gave him some command over water, and the word holy, which gave water special powers that even nature could not give. If you step back for a moment and just think about how amazing that is, right? Like, what a strange kind of animal we are, you know? And again, we watch those comparative psychology kind of investigations regarding chimpanzees. You know, they don't seem to think in terms of, you know, invisible phenomena. They don't seem to operate in the world in that way. They don't even seem to kind of use pointing in a symbolic way to gesture toward what is not there. You know, and that we had this way of being in the world, this sort of, that we can engage in these sort of magical incantations, you know, and then something like water can take on these holy properties for people who are religious adherents. And it has meaning and significance, you know, for such individuals, you know. I mean, it's a very strange thing if you step back and notice it. And, you know, for people who are more scientifically minded, they would look at this, you know, and kind of smirk and say, well, that's just, you know, ridiculous, you know, whatnot. But I think they fail to realize, like, how much of this sort of, you know, symbolic comportment we engage with on a daily basis. So in the words of Rollo May, symbols and myths are the most vital parts of our experience. So symbols represent and express shared values, beliefs, hopes, wishes, fears. Now, in many ways, these are jointly held or understood, you know, longings or existential needs that we have. And symbols speak to these needs or desires that we have. They speak to existential truths, like truths that are just part of the human condition, right? It's not true in a scientific sense. It's true in a lived sense. They speak to our sense of our need for unity, a need for connectedness, coherence, intelligibility. So Lady Justice speaks to our need for the world to make sense, for it to be just, you know, that people who do evil, that they become held accountable, you know, for, you know, the senselessness of their actions and so on. When you think of the symbolic quality of a flag, you know, there is sort of an emotional kind of connectedness or a resonance of sorts when you identify with the flag of your nation or your country, isn't there? Or conceivably. What are some instances where that would manifest itself or become obvious? Does anyone have any?
The burning of the flag.
Yeah. So, if someone was to desecrate the flag, to burn the flag, like rather than it be just this, piece of cloth that doesn't have any meaning or something, like we are very upset about this sort of thing, right? It's offensive because the flag stands for something, or we believe that it should. Yeah.
At the Olympics, like teams wearing flags, kind of like jerseys and stuff.
Yeah, good. So what is it about watching the Olympics? So we watch the Olympics and we say, okay, these different nations are kind of competing and whatnot. But when we see, like, if you're watching this, you're Canadian, you see, the Canadians win like a gold medal or something like that. How do we tend to react to that? With pride, like, my God, like these fellow, countrymen and women, like they have, kind of done something difficult. They have suffered for years to develop themselves and to compete, at this high level, for our country, and that when we see them kind of, I don't know, like be able to perform at that level, like we feel like we're a part of that. We feel a sense of connectedness. So symbols can often evoke strong sentiments, strong emotions, both positive and negative, and so again, if you think about like a wedding ring, what does that symbolize? Well, it symbolizes commitment, it symbolizes love, it symbolizes, a shared life, an intertwining of lives, a joint being in the world with another person. The gravestone is again, it symbolizes a life that was and no longer is. It affords an opportunity for a solemn remembrance, and holding on to that person and what they meant for you in the time that they were alive. For many people, the Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, it symbolizes hope and opportunity, and protection, the swastika, again, for most people who are familiar with history, it symbolizes hatred and senseless violence and murder and genocide, And we have, emotional reactions to these things. Symbols are used in cultural rituals and carry meaning. Now, I grew up Catholic to a certain degree, went to church, but we weren't like hugely religious. But does anyone remember like anyone who grew up, with that sort of, grew up Catholic, you go to church, especially Easter time, right, and you receive the sacrament. Do you remember what they say when they give you that little piece of bread? Does anyone remember? The body of Christ, right? What's that? Broken for you, yeah. So the body of Christ, so it's just a piece of bread, it's just a wafer, right? But it's symbolic of the body of Christ. And what does that mean? Well, I think it means something to the effect of, well, this is in remembrance of Jesus who had sacrificed himself for the sins of humanity. And, this is his body, and you are to remember that sacrifice and consider as you take this, are you worthy of that sacrifice? Myths are stories that often contain symbols, and they embody the rules, the lessons, and the values of our society and culture. They help orient us within the world. They tell us what is important, what is worth attending to, and give us a guide potentially of how to think about our situation and possibilities that we might take up for ourselves. Many writers and poets have been really fond of the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus was in ancient Greek times was one of the titans. He was one of these titans, and the ancient Greek gods had this war before human beings existed. This war between Zeus and his adherents and the titans, and the titans lost. But there were two titans, Prometheus and Epimetheus they aligned themselves with the Greek gods, and they were rewarded for their patronage. And so they were tasked with the goal of populating the earth with beings. And so Epimetheus was tasked with populating the world with animals with various qualities and attributes, and fish and bears and all this other sort of thing. And Prometheus, if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly, was tasked with creating people. But when he looked at the creations of Epimetheus, he couldn't find anything that would give the human beings some advantage, and they were to be made in the image of the higher gods. And so Prometheus, not wanting his creation to be unfairly disadvantaged, went up into the heavens and stole fire from the gods, knowing very well that that this was not going to turn out very well for him. So he did this as an act of kindness, or in a sense, a just act, to help humanity in a sense. And he also, in addition to giving fire, taught human beings, the art and certain aspects of civilization and tool building and that sort of thing. In a way, you could say, well, he gave human beings their freedom in a sense, or consciousness in a sense. And so for that, he was punished. He was chained to a rock, and a vulture had picked at his liver until it was devoured, and then the next day it would sort of regrow, and then that morning it would be picked at again. So in this sense, like in the ancient Greek mythology, he was like one of the original rebels, right? Again, rebelling against the gods to do what was right, knowing full well like that he would be horribly punished for it. And he's also like a heroic myth in terms of how to bear, this suffering with dignity. So there's some really interesting, kind of morals in some of these mythical stories. So we find myths in the implicit assumptions of our culture and use them as guides for living. They are constitutive of our being in the world. Now, I'm going to use, the term like myth in kind of a non-technical sense, I guess, or, you should know, like, this is not like a huge strong suit of mine, but I think I have a fairly good grasp of it. In the technical literature, it seems like there's no agreed upon definition of a myth, but it seems to me we could kind of break it down into three different ways three different ways, I guess. So we can think of mythology as like a pre-scientific understanding of the world. Like we have myths that allow us to understand the world, before the advent of science, right? And so we can have this denigrating attitude, I suppose, toward myths. That myths are outdated, they serve no purpose. Once we get our scientific sort of theorizing off the ground, we can do away with myths. I don't think that's the most appropriate interpretation or understanding. That's certainly true to a certain degree, right? But another way of looking at it is that in line with what we're trying to highlight here, is that myths speak to our lived existential truths and realities. So existential dilemmas, or just how we find ourselves in the world and what we're having to confront and deal with, and rough guides for action. So they help orient us in the world in a way that can encourage, an authentic, moving forward into possibilities. So that's one interpretation. And so we can look at these myths as having, values that we can kind of extract and utilize in our lives. Another way of and I think this is the interpretation that, Carl Jung would take, or Campbell, or Peterson, and so on. Another way of looking at it, though, is that as much as they could, offer an authentic guide or possible ways of being, they can just as well cover over an authentic understanding of ourselves. And our myths can conceal, our myths can help us provide like a psychological anesthetic in a way to allow us to just, dwell within a world comfortably and free from anxiety. And this is, in a sense, an inauthentic way of being. It involves a life that is not owned authentically, but rather something that is taken over by the collective interpretation.
What would an example of that be for you?
Well, we'll get into that, I think, actually, in the next slide. So, example of that would arguably be the consumer capitalist myths, like the intuitive understanding. When we say it out loud, of course, we would claim to deny it, money buys happiness. Oh, no one really believes that. And yet when you look around, it seems that people take up that attitude, It's not just that money, gets us out of physical suffering. I mean, that's certainly true. But there is a sense of just wanting more and more. In this conspicuous consumption, right? Being able to display, the things that we buy as if that has meaning, as if that somehow, kind of puts you above other people. That if you have the newest iPhone, you're that much cooler than the next person who has like 2 versions outdated or something, So in answer to the question, what is the purpose of life? Well, the purpose of life is to go out there and to get an education. And why do you do that? So you can get a job. And why do you do that? So you can earn money. And why do you do that? So you can buy a house. And why do you do that? So you can, kind of build up a savings. And why do you do those things? So you can kind of move up corporate ladders and have more money. And why do you do that? So you can retire and do all kinds of things and buy nice things. And why do you do that? And, there's this sort of implicit in order to kind of structure that we take up as a template without really kind of questioning, well, so now I'm retired and I'm on my deathbed, what the hell is all that for? We don't usually to stop to think about those things. So we're told that happiness is, or it's implied rather, that happiness is just around the corner, so just work harder, earn more money, buy more things, keep going, and so on. So that would arguably be a myth loosely defined. Now, I don't know if someone like Jung would call it a myth. I think he might call it just, like an ideological, dogma or something, sociocultural, whatever. I think someone like Becker would call it a myth or a symbolic, kind of cultural structure. According to Joseph Campbell, mythology is ultimately and always the vehicle through which the individual finds a sense of identity and a place in the world. And I'm going to show you, I think, just a collage of video clips from Joseph Campbell talking about this.
Why myths? Why should we care about myths? What do they have to do with my life?
These bits of information from ancient times, which have to do with the themes that have supported man's life, built civilizations, informed religions over the millennia, have to do with deep inner problems, inner mysteries, inner thresholds of passage. And if you don't know what the guide signs are along the way, you have to work it out yourself. But once this catches you, there is always such a feeling from one or another of these traditions of information of a deep, rich, life-vivifying sort that you want to give it up. Your own meaning is that you're there. Now we are so engaged in doing things to achieve purposes of outer value that we forget that the inner value, the rapture that is associated with being alive is what it's all about.
But don't you think that Americans, modern Americans, have rejected this idea, this Indian idea, this ancient idea of nature as revealing the divinity because it would have kept us from achieving dominance over nature?
Yeah, but that's the biblical condemnation of nature that they inherited from their own religion and brought with them. God is not in nature. God is separate from nature, and nature is not God. And this distinction between God and the world is not to be found in basic Hinduism or Buddhism either. I'll never forget the experience I had when I was in Japan. To be in a place that never heard of the fall in the Garden of Eden. To be in a place where I can read in one of the Shinto texts, the processes of nature cannot be evil. When every impulse, every natural impulse, is not to be corrected, but to be sublimated, you know, to be beautified. And the glorious interest in the beauty of nature and cooperation with nature and coordination, so that in some of those gardens you don't know where nature begins and art ends. This to me was a tremendous experience, and it's another mythology.
Speaking of different mythologies, let's just have a little fun here. I took these from your atlas.
Oh, yes?
I'll read Genesis. I'll read from Genesis, and then you identify and read from the corresponding text.
Yes.
Genesis 1. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Now this is from a legend of the Basari people of West Africa. Unumbote made a human being. Its name was man. Unumbote next made an antelope, named Antelope. Unumbote made a snake, named Snake. And Unumbote said to them, "The earth has not yet been pounded. You must pound the ground smooth where you are sitting." Unumbote gave them seeds of all kinds and said, "Go plant these."
And Genesis 1. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good.
And from the Upanishad, then he realized, "I indeed am this creation, for I have poured it forth from myself." In that way, he became this creation. And verily, he who knows this becomes in this creation a creator. That's the clincher there. When you know this, then you've identified with the creative principle yourself, which is the God power in the world, which means in you. It's beautiful. But what the myth has to provide, I mean, just on this immediate level of life instruction, the pedagogical aspect of myth, it has to give life models. And the models have to be appropriate to the possibilities of the time in which you're living. And our time has changed, and it's changed and changed, and it continues to change so fast that what was proper 50 years ago is not proper today. So the virtues of the past are the vices of today. And many of what were thought to be the vices of the past are the necessities of today. And the moral order has to catch up with the moral necessities of actual life in time, here and now. And that's what it's not doing. And that's why it's ridiculous to go back to the old-time religion. The old period of the Old Testament, no one had any idea. The world was a little three-layer cake, and the world consisted of something a few hundred miles around the Near Eastern centers there. No one ever heard of the Aztecs, you know, or of the Chinese even. And so those whole peoples were not considered even as part of the problem to be dealt with. The world changes, then the religion has to be transformed.
But it seems to me that is what we are in fact doing.
That's in fact what we better do. Yeah. But my notion of what the real horror today is what you see in Beirut, where you have the three great Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and because the three of them have three different names for the same biblical God, they can't get on together. They're stuck with their metaphor and don't realize its reference.
So each needs a new myth.
Each needs its own myth all the way. Love thy enemy, you know? Open up. Don't judge.
Given what you know about human beings, is it conceivable to you that there is a point of wisdom beyond the conflicts of truth and illusion by which our lives can be put back together again? That we
Sure.
can develop new models?
It's in the religions. All religions are true. for their time. If you can find what the truth is and separate it from the temporal inflection, just bring your same old religion into a new set of metaphors, and you've...
So there was a lot of stuff, I think, in what he's laying out there. But is there anything in that you find interesting, or that you'd like to comment on, or question, or... I mean, it's hard, though, to see... I mean, arguably, it would be hard for many people, like the masses, so to speak, to see their religion as merely metaphorical, you know, because it kind of destabilizes, you know, part of their, I don't know, like their truth system or something, like that gives them a sense of stability and helps them deal with other existential issues in a way that is arguably not, it's inauthentic in a sense. Like people that really imagine that, well, this is only a temporary circus show, this life, you know, and the suffering that I endure, it's you know, to be for something, and that something is another life, you know. And so for many people, they really hold on to that and really believe it. And so to imagine that you know, these religious myths are just, you know, mere metaphor that you can use just in a metaphorical sense, I think threatens some of these other uses that a person might have for religious doctrines. Does that make sense? Yeah, other comments but we can make use of some of these myths insofar as, again, they speak to experiences that we all have. And, you know, one of the main ones is the archetype of the hero's journey, and so part of that journey is, you know, that there's this call to adventure, that you're beckoned in a way, or there's a calling to move away from what you know, from your average everyday way of being. And you can see that this is kind of divided up between the known and the unknown. The unknown, in a sense, you can think about in terms of the unconscious, or that which, you know, kind of lies just outside of awareness. And so if you think of this in terms of like your own development as a human being, you're venturing away from what is comfortable, like what you understand to be your situation or your own self-interpretation, and you're being invited, in a sense, to look at yourself in a deeper way, or to explore, you know, hidden or dormant possibilities within yourself. In a way, that's kind of what therapy is, in a sense. You know, like you can even think about it that, well, a person feels that call and they experience it perhaps as like an anxiety, or there's something, you know, in their life that has become, I don't know, rattled, or, you know, that problematic in a sense, and now they have to do something, but they don't know what that something is, and so they meet with a therapist, and a therapist kind of serves as something of a guide, in a sense, right, and encourages them to explore parts of themselves that you know, that they hadn't even known existed in a way. And so, like the myth of the hero's journey, in a way, can be like a metaphor that can encourage us to explore, you know, these terrifying parts of ourselves, you know, to open up again that capacity, that clearing, you know, to experience and encountering the world and people in more authentic ways. So in the hero's journey, there's this call to adventure, and there's often like a mentor or helper along the way, and then in the there's this point of crisis, you know, in the depths of one's unconscious, encountering, you know, these terrible parts of yourself, emotions maybe that you hadn't quite dealt with, and through that there's a victory of sorts. You know, a part of yourself maybe dies, or you save a part of yourself that had been hidden for years and what have you, and you're able to bring that back into your everyday existence in a way to help yourself and to help other people, and so on. You know, we have like hero stories and things that sort of lay this out, and you know, what that might look like, and it resonates with our experience, you know. For me, when I was a kid, it was reading comic books, back when comic books were actually good. And it lays out like these complex dilemmas and situations, like, and each person, like, I think, back when I would read comic books, like, you can understand in a sense, like, what an individual's dilemma is by the comic book characters that they're drawn to, and sort of the struggles that they have, and they sort of resonate with personal struggles that you have, in a sense, and it points a direction out. So through the symbolic, myths can offer us more than what the material world can provide. So again, a sense of meaning, a sense of security, direction, unity, predictability, justice, and so on. We can reconcile and embrace opposing thoughts, desires, and feelings through the myth. So, and I'm using this more in the maybe the negative sense of covering over or concealing, something that is an uncomfortable reality or truth. So our desire for justice in an unjust world. Well, if you have a religious belief that says, well, yes, the world appears to be senseless, it's unjust, there are children suffering and dying, there are people who are being murdered, and there doesn't seem to be any justice there, So how do we reconcile this reality with our longing for justice in this unjust world? Well, we imagine that there's a heaven, that there's an afterlife, and these individuals will be held accountable for their actions, and there's a terrible place for them, and it's called hell, right? And that's a satisfying thought in a way, and the people that suffer, on the side of goodness, that they, endure these hardships to try to create something positive, that they will be rewarded in this afterlife. Well, all that's a very nice thought, and sort of reconciles in a way this problem. But it prevents us in some ways from being able to confront the reality of our situation as well. So arguably there's something inauthentic in sort of interpreting the situation in that way. I'm going to read you just a little passage from Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov. Has anyone read this book? It's a really great book. And there's a passage here, it's about three brothers and sort of this drama ensuing and a murder and so on. I won't spoil it for you, but there's a really interesting passage where one of the brothers, I think not the oldest, maybe the middle brother, is having this dialogue with his youngest. So there's Ivan having a dialogue with his brother Alyosha. And Alyosha was a religious adherent, and Ivan is engaging him on this and being critical of his stance and whatnot. And I find this kind of interesting because when we hear about like criticisms against religious belief, especially like the new atheist type criticisms, it's coming from more of a scientific attitude, the impossibility of there being a man in the sky and this sort of thing, right? And they kind of compare that to, flying spaghetti monsters in this critical way, right? Like, yeah, you can criticize in that way, but I think actually there are better criticisms that don't have to do with those sort of, I don't know, like causal, arguments. And it goes something like this. So the dialogue is about like the suffering of the world, and particularly the suffering of children. So Ivan, kind of speaks to that. And he says to Alyosha, "Can you understand that a small creature who cannot even comprehend what is being done to her in a vile place, in the dark and the cold, beats herself on her strained little chest with her tiny fist and weeps with her anguished, gentle, meek tears for dear God to protect her? Can you understand such nonsense? Can you understand why this nonsense is needed and created? Without it, they say, man could not even have lived on earth, for he would not have known good and evil. Who wants to know this damn good and evil at such a price? The whole world of knowledge is not worth the tears of that little child to dear God." He goes on to say, and if the suffering of children goes to make up the sum of suffering needed to buy truth, then I assert beforehand that the whole of truth is not worth such a price. I don't want harmony. For love of mankind, I don't want it. I want to remain with unrequited suffering. I'd rather remain with my unrequited suffering and my unquenched indignation, even if I'm wrong. Besides, they have put too high a price on harmony. We can't afford to pay so much for admission, and therefore I hasten to return my ticket. And it is my duty, if only as an honest man, to return it as far ahead of time as possible, which is what I am doing. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I just most respectfully return him the ticket. And like to me, that again, so the idea is that, well, we can't understand why children suffer, why there's this horrible injustice. It's part of God's mystery, right? It's part of God's truth. And what Ivan is saying is that whatever that truth is, I don't want it. I want nothing to do with it. I assert that it is wrong, and I will suffer in hell for it if I have to. And that's, again, there's sort of like an echoing of that Promethean kind of rebel in this attitude, which I think is really nice. Any comments about that? Yeah. I mean, one way of looking at it is that, like, everybody suffers. Like, everyone has to endure some amount of pain and suffering and loss, and it's arguably like the most personal thing, like what freedom you have. Like, certainly there's the freedom to choose the attitude that you take toward that suffering and how you carry yourself, in the face of those hardships. And so, however you choose to interpret that. I mean, another way of just interpreting that without the religious gloss is just that, like, well, the world is cruel and senseless, and like I want things to be easier than they are, but they're not, and it's a challenge to me. The universe is calling to me to do something. How am I going to confront this? What am I going to do? Am I going to just flee from this challenge and become resentful and bitter, and or am I going to face this challenge as openly as possible and see what I'm made of, see what I'm capable of? And I think that's a more like authentic, like existential kind of approach to these kinds of things. I'm just going to maybe kind of venture in a little bit on this segment, death, and we'll kind of get into a little bit of the terror management theory maybe next class, but there's another little video clip that I wanted to show you. This is actually Robert Stolorow speaking about, I think, trauma and how some of this existential stuff plays into that.
When did you begin to pursue the topic of emotional trauma and to investigate its relationship to existential dread and anxiety?
Well, I first began to think about emotional trauma in the context of writing a paper with my late wife, Daphne, Dee. We wrote an article that was published in 1985, and without going into details about it, the idea was to put affect, emotional experience, at the center of everything. Then after Dee died in 1991, George Atwood and I started to lay out the chapters of a new book, the title of which became Contexts of Being, the Intersubjective Foundations of Psychological Life. And I wrote the chapter on trauma in that book, and it was essentially an expansion of those 2 or 3 lines that Dee and I had written in that article. Getting interested in the existential aspects took place as a result of an episode of re-traumatization that I experienced myself 20 months after Dee died. And I was at a conference where I was presenting, and that book that I just mentioned before came hot off the press right to the conference and was delivered to a display table there. So I went over, picked up a copy of the book, and I whirled around looking for Dee Dee to show it to her, because she would be so happy and excited to see it. And of course, she wasn't there, having died 20 months earlier. And what happened then was that I was taken back in an instant to the morning that I woke up and found her lying dead across our bed. And that's what I later came to call a port key to trauma, using a concept from Harry Potter. A port key to trauma, where one is instantly transported back to an experience of traumatization. Now, the state that I was in at that time, I was like destroyed for the rest of the conference after that. And the state that I was in, the traumatized state that I was in, had two. One thing, I'm always trying to grasp my own agony, so that's one of the ways I come up with my ideas. Mm-hmm. Instead of turning away from it, I get into it and I try to grasp it and understand it. So there were two prominent features of the state that I was in. One was that I felt that my world had become meaningless. My world had lost its significance. That my professional world had become meaningless and insignificant to me. And the second feature was that I felt alienated from everybody, even though many of them were dear friends of mine. Many of the people there were dear friends of mine. So I felt alien, and I felt like an alien being, like I was from a different world. So those were the two features of my state that I experienced in 1992. So I remarried in 1994, and with my wife Julia's encouragement, I began to think about writing an article on that experience. What I came to was a concept that I called the absolutisms of everyday life. That is, these are an absolutism is like a belief whose validity is not open for discussion, it's not open for questioning. And things like saying to a friend, I'll see you tomorrow, or saying to a child at bedtime, I'll see you in the morning. These are like illusory beliefs that allow us to experience our world as stable and predictable and safe. Okay? So then it occurred to me that what happens in trauma is that trauma shatters these absolutism, it destroys them, so that there's no longer any safety or continuity of being, no longer any illusion of that. You're kind of face to face with I call it the groundlessness of existence or something like that. So that seemed to me to capture the essence of trauma, that it was a massive loss of innocence. And so I wrote that article, and it was published in 1999. And the basic idea there was that that the essence of trauma, looked at phenomenologically, is overwhelming emotional pain. Overwhelming, unendurable emotional pain, that was the essence of it. And then I said, and continue to believe, that the overwhelming nature of the emotional pain in trauma cannot be understood solely on the basis of the severity or the intensity of the injury, of the psychological injury. That the overwhelming nature of the emotional pain, the unendurable nature of it, is that it has to be borne alone. That there's no context of human understanding. Now I call that a relational home, in which that pain can be held, better borne, and eventually integrated. So that was a kind of relational or intersubjective understanding of trauma as overwhelming pain.
I really like his stuff. what do you make of that idea, the absolutisms of everyday life? I mean, that's an interesting kind of concept, isn't it? That, you know, that there are these just beliefs or attitudes that we just assume, right? Like something as trivial as, you know, I'll see you later, right? And then not even considering, like, just remotely, just for half a second, the possibility that may not happen, right? And so he talks about, like, you know, that the experience of the loss of his wife, I don't know if he said, but she was, you know, in her 30s, just absolutely shattered this, you know, the absolutisms that he had been, that had been like the foundation of the life that he was living in many ways, you know? Yeah.
Like, how does that relate to, like, children of, like in abusive households and stuff?
I mean, depending on the age of the child, depending on the nature of the trauma, like, I mean, a person may be painfully aware of, like, the fragility of some of these assumptions that we all seem to take for granted, you know, like a person may have just, like, absolute panic at the possibility of, you know, abandonment or loss or something like that based on their own experience of this sort of thing. They may not be intuitively aware of that, though. That may be something that is partially repressed or it shows up in some different way. Yeah. Well, what function do these absolutisms of everyday life, like, what do they have a function? Like, you know?
Positivity and thinking, like, the best is going to happen.
Like, look, if you were really to take this on, I don't mean just, like, know it, like, you know, like if you had a reminder on your iPhone just pops up, oh, you could die today. You know, like if you had these kind of intellectual, conceptual reminders, like, I don't know if that's what we're talking about. Like, you can know it in a sense. I mean, you could be working in the field of death denial and that sort of thing, and still be very much kind of protected from the experiential reality of some of this stuff. So if it doesn't move you, if it doesn't kind of, you know, cause you to feel a bit sick to your stomach and you know, worried and whatnot, I would say in a sense you don't really get it yet, or you get it on just a conceptual level. Like, people who are encountering some of this stuff for the first time, like, if you don't get, like, a little chill down your spine, like, again, like, you don't really quite get it, you know, or maybe you're not at a place in your life where you're open to kind of receiving it in that more authentic way, which is fine, you know. And so arguably you know, if we were to really feel the full weight of this stuff in our everyday waking moment, I don't know if we'd be able to function. I don't think we could. I think we'd go mad, you know, like, and so to a certain extent we have to get kind of caught up in our average everyday kind of way of being as a mode of just coping with some of this stuff. But arguably, as we'll talk about, like, you want to, from time to time, try to connect with that more visceral understanding, because it opens up, you know, authentic possibilities that you wouldn't encounter otherwise. That would be the message or the point. You know, and we know this intuitively, right? Like, we know this. Anyone who has had, you know, a near-death experience, you know, the people who are able to make use of that, like, it like, the next day after this horrible thing, like, had happened to them, the next day they will usually report, like, my God, like, this has been the most amazing day of my whole life. Like, I had, you know, breakfast this morning and it was like the most amazing, like, buttered toast with jam that I've ever tasted in my whole life. And just everything just feels so vivid and invigorating, and, you know, you just feel this impulse to want to call people up and say, look, I haven't talked to you in a long time, but I really love you, man. I really, really love you, you know, this kind of thing. And that's, could you be in that state forever? I don't think so. It would be exhausting. But again, like, to be opened up in that way where you can really take inventory of like, well, what matters here? What is significant? How am I living my life? Is this, if I were to die tomorrow, would, you know, is this, you know, would I be content with what I've done here? Yeah, does that make sense? You guys with me on that? Okay, so I think we'll wrap up there, and we'll see you guys back here on Thursday.